In 1994, 39-year-old Mauro Prosperi would endure something so intense that it would inspire a prince to write a poem about his experience. As a marathon runner, Mauro would hear of the Marathon Des Sables, a race held yearly in Southern Morroco in the Sahara Desert. This race is widely regarded as one of the toughest foot races in the world, requiring you to sign a form stating where you want your body to be sent should you die while participating. Now that may unnerve some people, but Mauro was a man who enjoyed pushing himself to the absolute limit. Immediately he would begin training, running 25 miles a day, and limiting his water intake to adapt to being dehydrated. Not long after, he gets on a plane and heads to Morocco. After arriving in Morocco, Mauro would say he felt a sense of amazement upon seeing the desert. The first few days of the marathon would go well for Mauro, who was in 4th position out of 80 participants. At each checkpoint, after receiving more water, he would set up camp and fly his home country's flag of Italy. However, on the 4th day, Mauro would be running across a sand dune when a sudden and violent sandstorm would hit. Using his scarf to protect his face, he turned his back to the wind and continued on to avoid being buried under the sand. The sandstorm would rage on for hours, forcing Mauro to find a sheltered spot to sit and wait. After 8 hours, it would finally die down, but by that time, the sun had set. Disappointed at the thought he had lost his 4th place spot, Mauro decided to try make the time up in the morning. When he awoke in the morning, he realized that the sandstorm had completely changed the landscape. Though he had a map and a compass for direction, all the landmarks on the map had been buried by sand. Though concerned thoughts crept into his mind, Mauro figured that at some point he would run into one of the 80 other runners, as they had encountered the same sandstorm. But unfortunately, after 4 hours of running, Mauro would climb a sand dune to find nothing but sand in front of him. As he started to realize just how grim his situation actually was, Mauro took inventory of what he had on him, which was a knife, compass, sleeping bag, and dehydrated food. While stocked up on enough food, Mauro realized he only had half a bottle of water remaining. Immediately, he decided to store his urine while it was still clear, a tip he had learned from his grandfather who had done the same in the war. This would be one of the many decisions that would eventually save his life. Coming to the conclusion he was lost in the Sahara Desert with potentially no one for miles, Mauro finally stopped running. This is when he would begin to walk through the endless landscape, finding any shelter he could along the way. The only comfort he really had was that someone, somewhere, would be looking for him when he failed to cross the finish line. On his 2nd day of walking, excitement would fill him when he heard a helicopter in the distance. It was flying so low that Mauro could actually see the pilot's helmet. Reaching into his bag and pulling out a small flare, he was certain he would be saved. But when he let off the flare, the helicopter continued to fly right past him. Defeated, Mauro had no other option than to continue walking through the desert. 3 more days would pass before Mauro would finally discover some sign of human life as he approached a shrine dedicated to a holy man, whose body and casket was located inside. When he entered, Mauro would only be welcomed by the bats living atop the ceiling of the structure. Though there were no people, Mauro had at least stumbled across shelter from the blistering sun, and surely at some point a visitor would arrive to pay their respects to the holy man. In the coming days, Mauro would camp out in the shrine and cook the dehydrated rations he had on him with his own urine. But soon, the thirst would become too much to bear. The constant sandstorms had filled the shrine with so much sand the ceiling was low enough to touch, and this would allow him access to the bats hanging above. In the time that he spent in the shrine, hoping someone would pass by, Mauro would catch over 20 bats. With his knife, he would then mush up their insides and suck out the blood to stay hydrated. On 2 occasions during his 3-day stay, he would come close to rescue. Once when a helicopter flew over the shrine but failed to spot him, and another where a plane would fly past but at the same time a sandstorm would hit, hiding him beneath its sand. After both aircraft failed to see Mauro, his thoughts turned to despair, and he attempted to logically consider his options. One major factor affecting his decision was the police pension his wife could receive if he did pass away. If Mauro did continue walking and eventually succumb to the desert, his body would be buried beneath sand. This was an issue because under Italian law, if he did just go missing and they could not find his body, his wife, who was at home with their 3 children, would have to wait 10 years to receive his pension. However, if he stayed in the shrine and died, there was more chance his body would be located and identified, which meant his wife would receive the pension without having to wait. Mauro would decide that rather than suffering a long agonizing death, he would end his own life in the shrine, where someone would at least find him. After writing a note for his wife with charcoal, Mauro would cut himself and wait to die. In the morning, he would wake up and find his blood was too thick for him to bleed out, and he would take this as a sign that he needed to continue. Mauro would leave the shrine and continue walking across the desert, killing any snakes or lizards he came across and eating them raw to survive. On his 8th day, he would finally find an oasis and with it, water, but he would notice something just as important as the water, a footprint. This would drive Mauro forward and he would continue before spotting a goat and then finally a young shepherd girl. Seeing this gaunt, dirty man approach her, the girl would first run away from him and to a large tent. When Mauro got close to this tent, he would find a group of women who, upon seeing his condition, would give him goat's milk and attempt to feed him, but he would just throw it up. One of the women would also contact the police, who were located at a military base close by. Not knowing who he was and what he was doing there, they would first blindfold him before taking him back to their military base. Luckily, they would soon realize he was a lost marathon runner and take his blindfold off. After celebrating with the police, he would be informed that he had walked 181 miles off course and had crossed the border into neighboring Algeria. Mauro had spent a total of 10 days out in the desert and lost 16 kilos. It took a total of 2 years to completely recover physically from the effects of his time out in the desert. 4 years after the event, Mauro would run the marathon once again, this time completing it, and express that he feels compelled to visit the desert each year as he can no longer live without it. On the 23rd of November 1942, Poon Lim was working as a second steward on a British armed merchant ship on its way from Cape Town to New York when a German submarine intercepted the ship and hit it with 2 torpedoes. In the 2 minutes before the ship sank, Poon was able to grab a life jacket and jump off board, narrowly escaping as the boilers of the ship exploded. Out of the 54 crew members, Poon and 5 others would survive the initial moments of the attack. After floating in the water for over 2 hours, Poon would find and climb onto a wooden raft. Luckily for him, it would contain several tins of biscuits, 11 gallons of water, some chocolate, 2 smoke pots, a flashlight, some flares, and a bag of sugar lumps. This would be more than enough for one man to survive for a short time until he was rescued, but unfortunately for Poon, his time lost at sea was far from over. Over the next coming days and weeks, Poon would be trapped on this lifeboat floating through the ocean before the supplies would begin to run out. To survive, Poon would fashion a fishing hook out of the wires inside his flashlight and nails on the raft and start to fish. Using the empty biscuit tins and some rope, he would then dry the fish to preserve it. He would also use the canvas life jacket which had initially saved him to catch rainwater. This would work for a while before a storm hit and spoiled not only his fish but also his remaining supply of water. Nearing death and desperate for any liquid, Poon would eventually catch a bird and drink its blood to fight off dehydration. Poon was then able to use the remains of the bird as bait, and upon seeing a group of sharks only a few feet away from his boat, he would decide to try catch one. Throwing the bird out on a rope he had intertwined, Poon wrapped his hands in canvas and waited for one of the sharks to take the bait. Once one did, he pulled it into the raft, where the shark started to bite him. Grabbing his water jug, now filled with only seawater, Poon was able to beat the shark to death. After cutting it open, he would drink the blood from its liver and remove its fins to dry out. By this point, Poon had been lost at sea for over 4 months and had even been spotted on 3 separate occasions without being rescued. The first time, an unidentified freighter would pass by, and the crew of the ship would see him in the ocean on a raft nearing death, but refused to even greet him as he yelled out in English. Poon believed they refused to rescue him because he was Asian and they thought him to be a Japanese soldier. The second time, a German submarine performing gunnery drills by shooting seagulls would spot him, but fortunately would leave him floating. The third time, a US Navy seaplane who spotted him would drop a marker for him so they could come back to find him, but a storm would hit around the same time and he would once again find himself lost at sea. On April 5th, 1943, after 133 days out at sea, Poon would slowly start to notice the deep color of the sea change and realize he was no longer in the ocean and closer to land than he had ever been. This is where 3 Brazilian fishermen would find and rescue him. His ordeal would see King George award him a British Empire medal, and the British Royal Navy would incorporate his story into their manuals for survival techniques at sea. When Poon was told he had survived longer than anyone lost at sea on a raft, he would reply, "I hope no one will ever break that record." Sadly, his record would be broken by 3 Mexican sailors in 2005 who spent over 10 months at sea on a disabled fishing boat. When the war ended, Poon would attempt to immigrate to the United States and was first told that the United States had already reached its quota for Chinese immigrants. The one positive thing to come from his experience was his notoriety, which would result in a US Senator helping him achieve citizenship. Poon would live out his days as a United States resident in Brooklyn, and on the 4th of January 1991 would pass away at the age of 72. That's it for today, guys. Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the video, and if we learned anything, if you really need to survive, drinking blood seems to be the way to go.